Imagine building one of the most revolutionary companies in history, only to be kicked out of it. At just 30 years old, Steve Jobs had already changed the computer industry forever. He was the face of Apple, the visionary, the genius behind the Macintosh. But inside Apple, people were turning against him. Employees feared him. Executives hated working with him. And the company he helped create believed he was becoming a problem. Then one day, Apple chose someone else over Steve Jobs. And the man who founded Apple walked out of the company with nothing. This is the story of why Apple fired Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was never supposed to become a billionaire tech icon. Born in 1955 and adopted shortly after birth, Jobs grew up in California during the rise of Silicon Valley. From an early age, he was different, obsessive, intense, brilliant. He wasn't an engineer like Steve Wozniak. He wasn't the best programmer in the room, but what Jobs had was something far more dangerous: vision. In 1976, inside a small garage, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded Apple Computer. Their mission? To put a computer in every home. At the time, computers were giant, expensive machines used mainly by governments and corporations. But Apple changed everything. The Apple II became one of the first massively successful personal computers. And suddenly, Apple exploded. Money poured in, investors rushed in, and Steve Jobs became one of the youngest millionaires in America. But success changed him. The bigger Apple became, the more difficult Jobs became to work with. Former employees described him as demanding, ruthless, and impossible to satisfy. If he hated your work, he would tell you directly. And if he loved an idea, he pushed people beyond their limits to achieve it. Some called him a genius. Others called him a tyrant. But Steve Jobs believed one thing: great products require greatness from people. And that belief would soon start a war inside Apple. In the early 1980s, Jobs became obsessed with one project: the Macintosh. He wanted to create a computer so simple and beautiful that ordinary people could use it. This was revolutionary. At the time, most computers looked intimidating, but the Macintosh felt human, friendly, creative, different. Steve Jobs pushed the Macintosh team relentlessly. Employees worked insane hours. Some even slept inside the office. But Jobs convinced them they weren't just building a computer, they were changing the world. Then came 1984. Apple released the legendary Macintosh commercial during the Super Bowl. And overnight, the Macintosh became one of the most talked about products in the world. Steve Jobs looked unstoppable. But behind the scenes, Apple had a massive problem. The Macintosh wasn't selling enough. The computer was expensive. It lacked software. And many businesses still preferred IBM computers. Meanwhile, Jobs was spending huge amounts of money and creating chaos inside the company. Apple's board began to worry. Was Steve Jobs truly a visionary, or was he destroying the company from the inside? Ironically, the man who would help remove Steve Jobs from Apple was hired by Steve Jobs himself. His name was John Sculley. At the time, Sculley was a successful executive at Pepsi. Jobs famously convinced him to join Apple by asking, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or come with me and change the world?" Sculley joined Apple as CEO. At first, the two worked well together, but eventually their relationship collapsed. Sculley believed Apple needed stability, structure, and discipline. Jobs believed rules slowed innovation. Meetings turned into arguments. Executives picked sides, and the company became divided between people loyal to Jobs and people terrified of him. Then Macintosh sales continued to disappoint. Apple's board slowly began losing confidence in Steve Jobs, and behind closed doors, conversations began about removing him from power. In 1985, Steve Jobs attempted to regain control of Apple. According to reports, Jobs planned to push Sculley out while he was away on a business trip, but Sculley found out, and instead of resigning, he fought back. A board meeting was called, executives gathered, and Apple had to make a choice: Steve Jobs or John Sculley. The board sided with Sculley. Steve Jobs was stripped of control over the Macintosh division. The company he founded no longer trusted him. Imagine that moment, at just 30 years old. Steve Jobs walked through Apple's hallways, knowing he had lost. Employees avoided eye contact. Projects were taken away from him, and slowly, he became irrelevant inside his own company. A few months later, Steve Jobs resigned from Apple. Publicly, it looked like a business decision. Privately, it devastated him. Jobs later admitted he felt like he had failed publicly. He even thought about leaving Silicon Valley forever. But what happened next changed technology history forever. After leaving Apple, Steve Jobs founded a new company called Next. The computers weren't commercially successful, but the technology was powerful. At the same time, Jobs bought a small animation company that would later become Pixar, and that decision changed Hollywood forever. Pixar created Toy Story, the world's first fully computer-animated feature film. Meanwhile, Apple was struggling. Without Jobs, the company released confusing products, lost innovation, and started collapsing financially. By the mid-1990s, Apple was in serious trouble. Then came the unbelievable twist. Apple bought Next in 1997, and just like that, Steve Jobs returned. The man Apple pushed out was now coming back to save it. When Steve Jobs returned, Apple was weeks away from disaster. He simplified products, cut unnecessary projects, and rebuilt the company around innovation. Then came one revolutionary product after another: the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad. Apple transformed from a struggling computer company into one of the most powerful companies on earth, and Steve Jobs became a legend. Ironically, the same traits that got him pushed out of Apple in 1985 were the exact same traits that later saved the company: his obsession, his intensity, his refusal to accept average. Apple once believed Steve Jobs was the problem. Years later, they realized he was the future. Steve Jobs' story isn't just about technology. It's about failure, ego, vision, and redemption. The company he built rejected him, but instead of disappearing, he came back stronger and changed the world again. Sometimes one history's biggest failures become its greatest comebacks. What do you think? Was Apple right to remove Steve Jobs, or was it the biggest mistake in tech history?